Hello, welcome back to my channel, and this is the 100th video on my channel. Thank you to everyone for your continuing support. So I thought I'd really indulge myself today, and this is what I want to talk about. Have you ever come across a movie which is utterly despised? I'm not just saying that it gets bad reviews and you watch it and you think it's okay. I'm talking about a film that gets a real critical drubbing, that is snarled at, that if you like it, there must be something wrong with you. And then you watch it and you find that not only do you think it's okay, more than that, you love it. And it actually becomes a really important film to you. And I'm going to introduce you to 8 films today, which really surprised me. Everyone else said how much they loathed them, and I really liked them so much that I wanted to have them in my own collection. The film that kind of inspired this video and that I want to lead off with today is Mademoiselle, directed by Tony Richardson. This was an infamous flop in the 1960s. Tony Richardson was one of the leading directors of British cinema at the time. He'd made Look Back in Anger, he'd made The Entertainer with Laurence Olivier, he'd made Tom Jones, which was an Oscar-winning film. He was one of the leading lights of the kind of kitchen sink school of filmmaking. And the sort of angry young men that appeared in the late 50s, early 60s. Not a director I was ever terribly fond of, to be honest. My favourite film of his used to be The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, but that's mainly because of Tom Courtenay's absolutely incredible performance in it. So I wasn't expecting much from Mademoiselle. This film got lethal critics, really lethal critics, but I watched it out of interest. And what I discovered was a film that absolutely bamboozled me. I thought it was quite brilliant. The film stars Jeanne Moreau, and it's set in a French village. And Jeanne Moreau is this spinster school teacher, and she starts to take revenge on the village around her. She falls for an Italian immigrant who is part of a lumberjack group cutting down trees in the forest. And somehow her infatuation with him and her growing relationship with his boy, who she teaches, develops into a twisted sort of vendetta against everything that she can't have. And she starts burning down buildings in the local area and killing farm animals, sometimes just to see him rescue people from the flames. So it's a very twisted film. It's adapted from a script by Jean Genet. Originally, I think Jean Genet had intended the script to be played by Anouk Aimée and made by a sort of French director, but Richardson got hold of it and made it as part of Woodfall Films. And it was a big effort for Richardson. He left, British cinema, where he'd forged a reputation. He went over to France. He used French actors. They made 2 versions of the film, one in French dialogue, one in English dialogue. The recent BFI release only has the English dubbed dialogue, which works against the atmosphere of the film, it has to be said. Then it got released, and it got absolutely trashed. What I saw was a really beautiful, haunting, fascinating film. I think what happened here was 2 things. First of all, the critics, both in France and England, were lining up to see an English director fall flat on his arse trying to make a French art film, and couldn't wait to stick the knife in. Don't forget that English critics in those days, because of the Nouvelle Vague, were very francophile and would have been as anti an English director doing this as the French were. I don't think they were prepared to let him get it right. And secondly, I don't think that they really allowed the film to work on its own terms. I think what they were looking for is a realistic portrait of French country life. This is not that. They were looking to see whether he got France right. But it's not that kind of movie. What Richardson made is a fairy tale, a fantasy. This is a sort of idyllic, timeless vision of rural France. And the whole way it's filmed, it's beautifully shot. The photography is stunning, with great use of the cinemascope frame. So there's business happening here, and the weight of the forest is above them. You really feel the landscape. So there's often, Richardson and his cameraman pull back to long shot, and you're seeing characters out in the fields and the woodland in long shot. And the characters seem almost, surrounded by this landscape, this oppressive, hot, quiet, empty landscape, of rural France. And really the whole thing it builds its own world. It's a world out of time, out of place, a fantasy landscape. And I think the original critics didn't quite get that. You know, Richardson was not going for a realistic portrait of rural France. He was going for a timeless, mythical, folkloric portrait. And within this, Moreau gives this brilliant performance as this bitter, evil kind of stepmother figure, you know, like the sort of Wicked Witch of the West. That's what she is. She's not a real character. She's kind of an emblem of vengeance and twisted desire. The whole film has that feel about it. You know, it's sort of almost oniric, almost primal. And I think that might have seemed silly, you know, in this era of the Nouvelle Vague and complex art house cinema from Europe. It might have seemed a bit silly. And Tony Richardson tripped up. But actually go back and watch it again. It's a really vital and brilliant film. Now let's go to the world of horror and talk about Exorcist II: The Heretic, one of the most hated sequels of all time. Oh my God, poor old John Borman really got it in the neck when he made this film. The Exorcist had been, up to this point, I think the most successful horror film ever made, one of the most successful films ever made, and was generally regarded as the most frightening film people had ever seen. Now, John Borman, a British director who I'm very fond of, he took up the sequel, and he made a classic error. He made the error of thinking that people who'd watched the original Exorcist cared about its themes and ideas, i.e. looking at this idea of religion, the Manichaean universe of God versus the devil, the idea of possession, you know, this idea of the religion in a modern late 20th century world. He thought this was interesting and he wanted to explore it. What a fool. Of course, the original audience didn't give a toss about that. They just thought, oh look, she's possessed by the devil and her head's twisting round and now she's walking down the stairs like a spider. And poor old John Borman, a genuinely new age director like Nick Rogue, he was interested in the ideas, in belief, in faith. So he made a very symbolic movie, not really a horror movie at all, but actually almost a fantasy movie. Unfortunately, it's weighed down by the presence of Richard Burton, who was well in his cups by this stage in the 1970s and gives a rather affectless performance as the priest who's losing his faith. But what happens is that the girl from the original film, played by Linda Blair, is now in this kind of asylum. And in this asylum, they're using this thing called the synchronizer. And what it is, it's this machine that beams light into two people's faces simultaneously. So they're both sort of hypnotizing each other. And they bring them down through light, so that they start to share the dreams in each other's minds. Complete nonsense, of course. But what a brilliant idea. Because isn't that what cinema is? We go into a darkened space, light is beamed into our eyes, and we start to share together an image, a dream image together. It's a metaphor of cinema. And through this sharing of dreams, him and the girl, he comes into contact with this African demon called Pazuzu, which takes the form of locusts flying through the air, a rather brilliantly realised image by John Borman. And eventually Burton goes over to Africa to confront this spirit. It's not a horror film at all. It's a strange kind of new age, crystal gazing type of way of looking, bringing faith as a structuring way of looking at the modern world. And of course, people who loved The Exorcist and enjoyed watching her spit green bile and levitate and all that sort of stuff were like, what on earth is this? And no one's given that film a chance. It's fractured, it's broken, it's flawed, and it's strangely beautiful. Go back and check it out. Fractured, broken, flawed, but beautiful. That is exactly the description of the third film I want to discuss in this video, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia by Sam Peckinpah. Now, when this film came out in the 40s, Peckinpah was starting to hit the drink and he was starting to hit the cocaine. He was starting to lose that great talent that we'd seen in The Wild Bunch and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and he was getting written off by the critics. This film was actually described as one of the 50 worst films of all time in their infamous book by the Medved brothers. Even Peckinpah's friend Robert Culp, an actor who I deeply admire, called it crap. Robert, what a misjudgment. Let's be honest, the film is difficult to defend, right? It stars Warren Oates in his best ever performance, in my opinion, but anyway. It stars him as this kind of club singer in this little bar in Mexico. And he finds out that the local bigwigs, the local jefe, is on the hunt for a guy called Alfredo Garcia, because Alfredo Garcia is a stud who screwed the jefe's daughter and got her pregnant illegitimately, and now there's a price on his head. Warren Oates sees his chance. I'll collect the bounty. So he takes off with his girlfriend, who is a local prostitute. And he finds out that this local prostitute, his girlfriend, has also been seeing Alfredo Garcia. So there's this undercurrent of sexual jealousy running through the film. The resultant film is as violent and as bloody as you would expect from a Sam Peckinpah film. It possibly is a bit racist. It's certainly homophobic in places. It's certainly misogynist in places. It's appallingly violent. It reaches an apogee of bizarre black comedy when eventually Warren Oates finds the head of Alfredo Garcia, literally his severed head, in a bag. He gets it off the baddies, puts it in his car seat, and he's driving along in Mexico, and he's talking to it. He said, "Oh, you and me, mate. It's you and me now." Weird black comedy. And it ends up in this spiral of violence, people just getting killed and killed and killed. And eventually the last shot is just a gun pumping bullets towards you over and over and over. Recalling that famous scene in The Great Train Robbery, that small silent short from 1903, that first time that someone pulled a gun and blew it at the camera. But this time now it's over and over again, a sickening, endless stream of violence. And after we see that, we cut to this beautiful music, the end credits, showing what Warren Oates has lost through all this violence, because eventually he loses his life. And we see what he's lost. Why am I here defending this movie? I think it's a piece of poetry. How can something be poetic when it's so riddled with violence and prejudice? You see, we live in an age where increasingly I think we're substituting ideology and correct thinking and correct intellectual thematics for poetry. Poetry does not conform, it doesn't follow rules, it doesn't follow guidelines. Sometimes a poem can be a cry of despair, and that's what the Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia is. It is a howl of, brackets, straight, male despair. And it's as ugly, as horrible, as haunting and fascinating as that description would suggest. It's an incredible film. I would argue it's a film best seen when you're young. I saw the film for the first time when I was about 22, 23. It hit me like a hammer blow. I've never recovered. It's a film of the gut. Not of the heart, not of the mind, not of the spirit. The gut. It spills out the guts and entrails of what's going on deep inside men. I would say if there's any female viewers of this video watching, I wouldn't watch it. You wouldn't like it. But if you're a man, it's so powerful and affecting and weirdly beautiful. There's so many scenes in it. One scene where Warren Oates is having this kind of idyll with his girlfriend by a tree. They're just talking about their life. But you can see the flaws in the relationship just where they speak to each other, and that Warren Oates is not going to make it. And as they follow Alfredo Garcia on this odyssey through Mexico, more and more the places they stay in are shittier and crappier and dirtier. There's more and more flies. They're getting sweatier and dirtier as they're not washing. And then there's this incredible scene right in the middle of the film that breaks the film, where the hoodlums jump Warren Oates and his girlfriend, kill the girlfriend, and they sling her and Warren Oates into this open grave. Warren Oates wakes up and he sees the dead body of his girlfriend flopping around in the soil beside him, and he howls. That howl is the keynote of the film. This is not just an exploitative, violent film. If you've got eyes to look and ears to listen, it is a beautiful poem of despair. It's not just a macho film. It's also about the self-destructiveness of machismo. The sort of sheer, horrible, apocalyptic force of it. I can't say how powerful an effect this film had on me. It's Peckinpah's most personal and most beautiful film. It's his most cracked and his most flawed. Robert Culp was right about that, but it's also his most beautiful. Please give it a chance. Staying in the West, we're going to talk now about a film that's very famous and is much beloved. Shane by George Stevens. Do you remember with Alan Ladd? And Alan Ladd comes to stays with his family out in their log cabin. And it's based on, the Johnson County Wars, that's right. It's the classic story where the lone gunman comes to the aid of some people who are being shoved off this land by this big cattle baron, that type of thing. What surprised me when I really got into movies and I started reading film criticism was how disliked Shane is amongst serious cinephile critics. They hate it. It's a popular classic, but amongst, sort of highbrow intellectuals, particularly French intellectuals, it's not very highly regarded. And the reason is this, because they feel this is a weird paradox that comes along sometimes in the discussion of art. So you'll get intellectuals who really love very serious, complex, demanding art films, but they also like genre films. They like simple action movies or film noirs or science fictions that have got no pretensions and are beautiful in their economy. What they dislike is the middle ground, your Oscar films, sort of well-meaning dramas that wear their heart on their sleeve and, tell stories in a simple narrative fashion. They either like the complexity and rigour of art films, or they like the dash economy and working class wit of genre films. Shane is seen as an Oscar film. It doesn't have the beauty of a regular Western. It's like someone's come along and I'm making an art Western. I'm making a serious Western. And that irritated the sensibilities of American and French critics. They thought that Western could stand on its own, as it can, I agree with them. But the thing is that let's take Shane out of that for a moment and just look at it as it is. It's a good story. It's beautifully told. Alan Ladd is surprisingly good as the hero. I'm not a great fan of him as an actor, but it works. And it's a very elemental mythic story that stays with you, beautifully shot as well, unusually brooding in the way it's shot. And it's been so influential. I mean, Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider is almost copying it, well, I was going to say word for word, but more sense for sense, let's put it that way. So, to me, to be dismissive of Shane is to be dismissive of a great work simply because it doesn't fall into the category of art house or genre. And that seems a bit unfair to me. I want to rescue it from that, as I also want to rescue its partner, High Noon, another popular classic from the Western genre that's despised by highbrow critics for very dubious reasons, I think. Why High Noon has been despised is because Howard Hawks criticised it. And he made a rebuff to High Noon. High Noon, you remember, is the one where Gary Cooper there's three baddies that are going to come back at noon to this town. And he goes around the townspeople saying, come on, help me out. And none of them will, so he has to face them on his own. Now, Howard Hawks rebuffed this and said, well, that's not how you should do it. The townspeople should be protected by people who know what they're doing, by professionals. And so he made Rio Bravo. And Rio Bravo is now regarded as one of the great films of all time, and High Noon is kind of sneered at because it's kind of like in opposition. Though why the two films should be in opposition, I don't know. It's that kind of combative criticism that comes from French criticism that I don't much care for. Why can't we just like both of them? But it's also kind of curious, let's think about this for a second. What Fred Zinnemann was doing in High Noon was what you might call the leftist take on the story. That we try to get the whole community to fight these bad guys. Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo is in some ways the conservative or right-wing idea that let the professionals take care of the people, right? This hardy band of warriors who were sort of made into heroes, are the people who protect the people. Yet, film culture, which is predominantly leftist, has gone with Rio Bravo and not with High Noon. Work that one out. The fifth film I want to discuss is To the Wonder, which I'll warn you now stars Ben Affleck, which I know is the kiss of death to any film, but actually it is good. Honest, I promise. To the Wonder was the film that Terrence Malick produced after The Tree of Life. Now you'll remember that The Tree of Life, which came out in 2013, was an extremely controversial film from Terrence Malick. Up until this point, Malick was one of the most admired directors in the world. He was one of the popes of cinema. This kind of mysterious figure who only made a film every so often. But with The Tree of Life, some people think he spoiled the bed. And he made a bit of a fool of himself. Some people raved about it, thought it was a masterpiece. I noticed quite a lot of people have picked it as one of their top 10 films in the recent Sight and Sound poll of the 10 best films of all time. And I'm a huge admirer of the film. But a lot of people felt that Terrence Malick had lost it and was starting to produce some kind of, glitzy car advert, 3-hour car advert sort of thing, with all sorts of slow-mo shots and beautiful shots of the sunset. And sort of, wispy voiceover saying, "What is love? Who are you? Where are you?" For me, I thought The Tree of Life was a brilliant step forward for an artist who'd been working in genre like Kubrick, making them very much his own films, but working in genre. In The Tree of Life, he broke free of genre. And he started making films how he wanted to make them, with complete freedom. As Rossellini said about Chaplin's The King of New York, it's the film of a free man. The films he made after that, though, have been utterly despised. Oh my God, they've had some of the worst criticism I've ever seen. To the Wonder, the film I'm talking about now, got absolutely kicked all over the place. And I thought I might be the only person in the world who liked it, until I discovered that one of my favourite critics, Gilberto Perez, a Cuban-American critic who died recently, sadly, he really loved it. Why do I like To the Wonder? To the Wonder is about Ben Affleck. He meets this young Frenchwoman played by Olga Kurylenko. They fall in love. She is willful and passionate, a bit crazy. He is steadfast and normal. He takes her back to live in Oklahoma with him in this housing estate. She feels trapped, claustrophobic. She's this bright spirit in a dull beer bottle sort of thing. And she's desperate to get out, and their relationship is falling apart. And meanwhile, Ben Affleck meets up with, is it Rachel Adams? I can never remember the name of that actress. An old friend, and their love starts to rekindle. And in the middle of all this is this priest played by Javier Bardem who's going through a crisis of faith. And it is absolutely, it's lots of, windswept photography, beautiful shots of bison, slow-mo shots, it's all very sort of ephemeral and fleeting, right? And with all these kind of voiceovers going, "What is love? Who are you? Where are we going?" Which drives most people up the wall. I think it's an extraordinarily beautiful film. I'll own that part of the reason I like the film is because there are elements in the relationship portrayed on screen that are similar to a relationship I had in my own life and my own feelings about it. So there is a personal element to me liking this movie. But I think that, as Perez intimated, I think people are somewhat embarrassed by the simple pureness of the way that Malick presents passion and love. We live in such a cynical age, such a smart-ass age, that actually pure passion and love and wonder at nature has come to seem ridiculous. And it's not. It's as beautiful and true as it ever was. And it's very present in this film. I mean, there's a shot of the sun falling on a fence in an Oklahoma suburban garden, which is as beautiful as anything in film. The breath rising from the nose of bison, who is huddling in against the screen. It's extraordinary. The shots of Mont Saint-Michel at the opening of the film are incredible. If you love beauty, you will love this film. The next film I want to talk about is Wonder Wheel. Now, this fell foul of things in the news. It was a Woody Allen film starring Kate Winslet. And it came out in 2017 at the new high watermark of this discussion of Woody Allen and Dylan Farrow, about which I have great doubts. I mean, when the Guardian newspaper, the left-wing newspaper in Britain, publishes an almost 4-page article by Hadley Freeman picking apart the Dylan Farrow case and showing the dubious nature of it, I think, you've got reason to be dubious about how Woody Allen has been treated. But I'm not here to talk about that. But what I'm outlining that because of what was happening in the news, no one went to see this film. It was utterly ignored. And later Kate Winslet said that she was sorry and ashamed that she'd been in it, which I think is a cowardly thing to do. If you take the dollar for money, you take the money for a film, shut up. You've done it. Just shut up. Just don't say anything. I think it's cowardly to say you're ashamed of it. How stupid. It's not as if the story about Dylan Farrow wasn't already public when she made the movie. Anyway. Now, Wonder Wheel is one of Woody Allen's little fable films that he does every now and again. It's sort of set back in the 30s, I think, maybe the 50s, in Coney Island, this fun fair near New York. And Kate Winslet plays this kind of put-upon wife of someone working in the fun fair, and his daughter by another woman comes back to live with them. She's being chased by members of the mob, and then Kate Winslet starts having an affair. The storyline, the plot is basic stuff. It's not terribly interesting. What is interesting is two elements. Firstly, Kate Winslet's performance, which is excellent, and in my opinion is better than Cate Blanchett in Blue Jasmine, who got an Oscar. And secondly, and most interestingly about this film, and why you should definitely check it out if you're a film fan, is I think I'm right in saying it was the last film where the cinematography was done by Vittorio Storaro, the great Italian cinematographer. And the whole film is an adventure in colour. So the whole film, Storaro and Woody Allen experiment with how different colours, different hues, the neons from the neon light from the carnival huts coming inside the window and bleeding into the light inside, and how those hues move and change with the different emotional hues of what's happening between the characters. It's an experimentation in changing the feeling of the audience, mirroring changing feelings of the characters, and it's beautifully done. It's a bit over the top, it's a bit lurid in places, but it's gorgeous and really affecting. I don't think Woody Allen is given anywhere near enough credit for the experimentation in his movies. For example, in the film Zelig, when he keeps putting his own image into found footage, it's this story of this man who is a chameleon, and he turns into whoever he's talking to. So if he's talking to some liberal politicians, he becomes very liberal. If he's talking to a Nazi, he starts developing a little moustache, doing Nazi salutes. And Woody Allen, worked with special effects people to put himself into found footage, and it's brilliantly done. And he never got any credit for it, which I think is disgraceful. And here, again, with Storaro, he really experiments brilliantly, I think. The seventh film I want to talk about is a British film called Privilege. And it was made by the documentarist Peter Watkins. Watkins had made a name for himself at the BBC with two brilliant drama documentaries, Culloden and The War Game, where what he did was he narrates a situation. Culloden was about the famous Battle of Culloden, the Jacobite rebellion, mostly Scottish army against a mostly English army. They met at Culloden. There was a terribly bloody battle. And what Peter Watkins did was he represented it as a modern news report. So you had sort of news reporters commenting on the battle and people being interviewed. It was brilliantly done. Then he made a film called The War Game, which was a projection of what Britain would be like after a nuclear bomb, and he used the same kind of techniques. But when he went into feature filmmaking, Watkins fell foul of the critics. Privilege was much ridiculed at the time it came out, but as life has gone on, Watkins' vision has been borne out, and the film looks more and more prescient and more clever. What it's about, it came out at the high point of British rock and roll, the Stones, the Beatles, the Who, all this stuff. And it's about this rock singer played by Peter Jones. And what it is, he does this act on stage where he's beaten up by the police and he's handcuffed and he's a victim of the authorities and the establishment, and all the kids are going, "Oh my God, yeah," and screaming, like they did the Beatles at the airport sort of thing. But what they don't know is that behind the scenes, the people funding him and backing him are the government. They're the establishment. And they're doing this deliberately because it's a sort of release valve for all these kind of youth and counterculture tensions. So what they're doing is they're controlling them, right? They're manipulating them to control them. And my God, doesn't that have resonances with the world we've lived in since? At the time, people thought it was paranoid and rather silly and ridiculous. Now, it almost seems naive. What is also interesting about privilege is not just that it's intelligent in its prescience about the way that older generations or establishments might use and manipulate youthful power against itself. What is also interesting is it's a brilliantly made film. It's gorgeously shot. I was astonished when I saw it for the first time. I couldn't believe a British film could look so beautiful, so beautifully composed, great use of moving camera, gorgeous colours, and you really feel this sort of moment. It was made in 1967, this moment of London going from swinging 60s to that post-60s period, and you've got Jean Shrimpton, as a famous model, is also in the film, so it feels very now and very present. It's a film very much of the 60s, but it also feels so relevant now. I'm going to finish with a film that I've discussed before on my channel, 300 by Zack Snyder. Yes, that's right, that one about the Spartans with all those men with six-packs going, "Roar!" That film, Now, when this film came out, the critics hated it. They were falling over themselves to say how shit it was, and they all said the same boring, monotonous, utterly predictable crap. The film is it's based on a comic strip graphic novel by Frank Miller. And it's basically about the Battle of Thermopylae, the Greco-Persian War. So it's about these Spartans, these Greeks, against the sort of Persians, Iranian, sort of Babylonia type. So for these critics, these liberal critics, they couldn't wait to say, "Oh, this is a racist film. Look at this. It's like, this is America versus Iraq, with the Greeks being the Americans and the Persians as the Iraqis." Hardly anyone who went to see the film thought that was true, but they couldn't wait to show their political credentials. And in the process, they missed a really interesting Hollywood experiment. You see, what's much more interesting about 300 is not its politics. Its politics is basically adolescent, verging on fascistic. That's not what's interesting about it. What's interesting about it is, here is a movie coming out of Hollywood in the era of the blockbuster and the Marvel Comics movie that is essentially an artifice-laden pantomime, right? A work of total and utter artifice, a work of total and utter theatre on film, almost avant-garde. All the backgrounds are CGI dioramas. There's no reality at all. There's no literal reality in the entire film. And what that does is, it raises the film to the level of myth, of exaggeration, as you would have in a Greek storyteller with people around the fire. Each detail is pumped up so that it's almost pantomimic, theatrical, over the top, operatic. That's the whole design of the film. For people to take it literally is stupid. The whole point that the sort of grotesquerie of the opponents, the Persian opponents, is part of the pantomime. It's not meant to be taken literally seriously. Not all Spartans looked like they had massive six-packs and they'd been in an LA gym for 18 hours. But that's part of the sort of weird fantasy world of the film. It's so strange to me that so many people miss that. You see, the problem is that if you look at Hollywood film too literally and you want to demonise it for its politics, you often miss those movies, those very few Hollywood movies, that are actually using similar techniques to European art house films. For example, like Eric Romer's Percival the Gaulois, which is a version of a 13th century poem by Chrétien de Troyes, if I've pronounced that correctly. It's a sort of Arthurian legend. And Romer filmed it all in a studio with artificial trees and little cardboard castles. And that film is praised, and I think it's a masterpiece. But Zack Snyder, in his own way, in a Hollywood studio with green screen, is doing the same thing. A conscious universe of artifice to tell a mythic story. But that got completely missed. So those are 8 films that are thoroughly despised by the critics, but which I love. I'd like to know what you think of those movies. Is there any other movies that are despised by other people that you really, really like? I'd love to hear about them. In my next video, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to do movies which are generally loved and are thought of as cinematic masterpieces that I can't stand. So look forward to that.